All right, thank you. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Matthias Grosse Perdekamp, from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So he's wearing two hats. He's a physics professor, and he's a member of the Physicists of Nuclear Threat Reduction. Today he comes to us as a member of the latter. So I'll just explain a little bit what his other hat consists in. So he got his undergraduate degree in 1990 in Freiburg, a PhD at UCLA in 1995. He's an experimental high-energy physicist. He joined the University of Illinois in 2002, and he's been working, so according to his website, mostly at Brookhaven on the Phoenix experiment, and at CERN on the Compass and Atlas. But, and this is where the two hats blend a little, he's been teaching a class on nuclear, on arms control since 2012. He has tried a little bit to apply his research to how to detect fissile materials. And in 2019, so he will explain us all about it, but the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction was created. An initiative that came from the APS, and he joined a few months after creation, and he's been a very active member of this initiative since. And give us more.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and also the invitation to the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction to come out here and speak to you today. What I want to focus on today are challenges to arms control treaties that try to minimize the risk for nuclear weapons. And I don't want to do this without first discussing the challenges that arise from nuclear weapons. So the Physicists Coalition was started 5 years ago by the American Physical Society with the help of the Carnegie Foundation. And the idea is to reconnect to rich history of the APS, where members of the APS lobbied for nuclear security and arms control historically. This then disappeared. Perhaps the end of the Cold War created the impression that nuclear weapons are less pressing of a problem, and the initiative largely faded away. We started with what we call a project team of about 15 members that travel the country and give colloquia. I think this is one of the first colloquia in Canada now. We try to expand and also talk to our international colleagues, as this clearly is an international challenge. And through this colloquia, we try to recruit physicists and engineers. Right now, we have a little over 1,100 members. And just past April, we did our first visit to Washington, DC, for what we called our first congressional engagement days, where there were 40 of us forming 10 teams, talking to 50 members and their staffers of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. And we try to point out to them risks that come with the large modernization program for nuclear weapons that started in the Obama administration. There's a program that presently is estimated to need $1.5 trillion to modernize the US nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. So the coalition is a group of physicists that tries to engage with Congress to do this in a responsible way, and maybe also do it in the least expensive possible way. And now, what does it mean turning international? I think in some cases, it's clear if we were to reach out to France or the UK, those countries have nuclear weapons programs themselves. But I think it also makes sense to reach out to countries like Canada, who are in NATO, who actually benefit of the American nuclear deterrent. and who should have a say and maybe could be influential in staking out the future and seeking dialogue with physicists here, with their own government, and then with the government in the neighboring country. So you're invited to join right from the beginning. You can take advantage of the educational opportunities that we offer. There are seminars, webinars, there are fellowships for young physicists, graduate students, postdocs, assistant professors. Then for lobbying, you're not constituents, obviously. So that part, I think, is for US residents. But I think the educational part of what we do might be of interest. So why now? Why should we worry about nuclear arms control? Well, it is simply that the regime of nuclear arms control that prevented the proliferation of nuclear weapons is under threat to collapse. One place where we can see this really well is the war in Ukraine, which is a major failure of the nuclear arms control regime. Let's look at the history. In 1991, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, Ukraine had inherited a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons, about 5,000 warheads, making it overnight the third largest nuclear power in the world. And then it was discussed and negotiated what to do with this. In the Lisbon Protocol, it was decided that Russia is the legal successor to the Soviet Union in terms of its nuclear armament and in terms of treaties that regulated nuclear arsenals. Now, obviously, the challenge for Ukraine is giving up its nuclear deterrent. At the time, Russia was in no position to be aggressive and to expand in the direction of Ukraine. But who would know that one could trust that this would stay like this in all future? There were critical voices in Ukraine itself, but also here in North America that warned and said Ukraine should hold on to its nuclear arsenal. Ukraine, however, was persuaded to give it up and to return these nuclear weapons to Russia. And in exchange, there was the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which nuclear powers, namely the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Russian Federation, guaranteed the safety and the integrity of Ukraine. Likewise, for Belarus and Kazakhstan, for example, other former Soviet provinces that had inherited nuclear weapons and now would return them to Russia. Now, the breakdown, I think, is quite apparent in front of us. 20 years later, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, a part of Ukraine. And 2 years ago, Russia opened an aggressive war against Ukraine and now occupies large parts of the country, of the order of 20 to 25%. And that is a clear failure of the deterrent that was in place. Think of other countries. Let's mention Iran. If they think of their relations with international powers, they very well may come to the conclusion that they need a nuclear deterrent. Quite obviously, we can't trust political or treaty solutions to guarantee the national interest of non-nuclear power. Yeah. So major challenge, I think, to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Now, why us? Meaning, why us as physicists? And today I want to talk about two things. I connect this to Robert Oppenheimer, maybe in part because many of us have seen the movie that came out last year, but also because Oppenheimer and his colleagues thought about many of the challenges that we're going to discuss today in their own time. But secondly, physics is a major contributor to the workforce that sustains both the civilian and the military nuclear complexes in the United States and in many other countries. Here is an example from my own area. This is the last long-range plan, I guess the cover sheet for nuclear science in the United States, where we boast with the importance of workforce contributions, that there's more than 600 trained graduate students over a period of 7 years since the last long-range plan, about a third of which I think enter in positions that are relevant for the nuclear weapons program in the United States. So we certainly carry some responsibility. We benefit from this. Many of our colleagues have careers in this area. Oppenheimer thought about this a long time ago. Here's a quote where he refers to the importance of, as a scientist, thinking about the ethical consequences of what we do. If I may read, he said, "Science without ethics is like a ship without a rudder. It may get somewhere, but it won't be where you want to go." One thing perhaps that I should say, do not underestimate the challenge that exists for non-scientists, for non-engineers who make decisions, be it in industry or politics or society at large, to understand the implications of technology that we as technical people, as scientists and engineers, provide them with. So it's an important responsibility for us to help society in its decision process. And historically, during the Manhattan Project, a vast project, $2 billion. I think in constant dollars today, this is $35 billion, roughly inflation adjusted. It had 30 major sites with more than 130,000 workers to produce the first nuclear explosion after about 2 years of intensive work late in the program that stretched actually all of World War II, starting in 1939. We see here Oppenheimer and General Grosse, who co-led this project. And I think if we look back at history, we will see that this was brought about without public discussion, actually without public knowledge. It was brought about by discussion in very limited scientific circles. That wasn't broad, it was within physics. And then military places that were relevant, again, very few people. And then also some politicians in the American Congress. And I think needless to say that most of the non-scientists had very little insight in where this would lead us. It basically has left us with this vast investments in arsenals that can be used to end human civilization as we know it. And that became apparent right after the first use of nuclear weapons in combat. This is an image taken in Hiroshima after the attack on August 6, 1945. More than 70,000 people were killed immediately. 70,000 were injured. Very devastating in Hiroshima because there's a lot of wooden structures, as you can see here, that also go up in flames. And it became clear to the scientists and also others that nuclear weapons can destroy entire cities. It's actually the only weapon that can do this. If there are many, if there are hundreds or thousands as we have it today, they actually can destroy a country. They can destroy the social fabric of a country, meaning transportation, education, medical care, etc. So unbelievably powerful weapons, a unique novelty in history. Nothing can be done in defense or in response that would lower the fatalities in a significant way. You cannot harden buildings so that they survive a nuclear explosion. You cannot provide the infrastructure that's needed for emergency response somewhere hidden away underground. This massive scales, in particular if many cities are affected. Now, no surprise, Oppenheimer and his colleagues realized this immediately And now 2 weeks later, he wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson and said, if atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of the warring world or to the arsenals of the nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. The people must unite or they will perish. So I think they already knew what we know today. This is a threat that really is a threat to end human civilization. And we have not, 80 years later, found a way to manage this threat in an effective way. Let's briefly consider what a nuclear attack would mean today. The image that I just showed you of Hiroshima is the explosion of a 15 kiloton fission weapon. 15 kiloton meaning the explosive yield is equivalent to the explosion of 15,000 tons of TNT. This is how we measure this. Today on strategic weapons, such as they are in the payload of intercontinental ballistic missiles, have yields of 500,000 kilotons to 1 million kilotons. So let's look at the consequence of a single million-ton attack. This is summarized in this image. If you attack a metropolitan area, think of your own home here in Toronto, the most effective way to detonate this weapon is actually well above in the air, as it was done in Hiroshima. In this case, the fireball stretches out in an uninhibited way over the maximum area, wreaking the maximum possible destruction on the city. So the height of burst for a 1 megaton weapon would be 1.4 miles for optimum destruction. And then this is what you get as a function of radial distance from ground zero. I don't want to go through this in too great detail, but even at 4 miles, the pressure wave is still at 5 psi. It's a pressure wave that destroys structures, that basically chops the wood, and then comes an enormous heat wave that sets them on fire. Think of a gas station that's somewhere in the city. It will break open the gas tanks and they will be set on fire. So this is not only structures destroyed, this is an enormous sea of burning debris. All the way out to 7 miles would this fires be started, and then out to 10 miles, minor destruction. Now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that die in a single attack instantaneously. Right now, with New START, the United States and Russia each have about 1,550 such warheads that could be launched against the adversary. So we have to look at the consequence of all-out nuclear war. I have a list here on the right-hand side of the slide. It is estimated, and this depends on daytime, this depends on weather, this depends on targeting. It is estimated that 50 to 150 million fatalities would occur on both sides immediately. Then there's a complete breakdown of healthcare, emergency response, industry, etc. Consider Hiroshima. In Hiroshima, people waited for 2 or 3 days, but then help came in from external cities. Thousands, tens of thousands of helpers, well equipped to respond to the very devastating situation in Hiroshima. This will be different in a modern war, because not only Chicago will be destroyed, so will be Detroit, so will be Minneapolis, so will be Urbana, Champaign. There's no place help could come from. This is what we mean when we say that an all-out nuclear attack has the potential to destroy the social fabric of a country. Then it turns out that there are more midterm and long-term effects. I have talked so far about the immediate effects of nuclear blasts, but let's consider fallout and then also nuclear winter. Fallout is simply that a lot of radioactively contaminated material is thrown in the atmosphere, travels downwind, and then will return and contaminate. Nuclear winter refers to all the materials that burn a lot of soot, black carbon getting into the atmosphere, absorbing the sunlight, and then cooling down the globe worldwide. I think there's some work here in your department on nuclear winter. I'm citing work from Alan Robock, who is a climate scientist, who is a coalition colleague of mine. He has looked at these scenarios and shows that depending on how severe this nuclear war is, millions up to billions of people will die from starvation. As in an all-out nuclear war, temperatures will drop for several years by many degrees. Here's a simulation from a Robock talk that shows what he calls a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan. You see how the soot distributes itself worldwide. On the left, how it raises up in the atmosphere above where it can rain out so that it will return to the Earth with a fairly long half-life. And the soot then interrupts the transmission of sunlight to the surface. Even in this scenario, with a limited war between Pakistan and India, the consequence will be food insecurity in the third world. I haven't looked this up recently. I think Robock estimates maybe 3 to 4 to 5 million deaths from starvation. If we now go to a full-scale war, we're not just 5 teragram of soot propelled in the atmosphere, like in this example, where I believe the number is almost an order and a half magnitude larger. Then temperatures drop to a point where agriculture on the northern hemisphere basically stops for multiple years. So very dramatic long-term consequences from nuclear war. Fallout. This is an old study from FEMA, I believe 1980s. This was largely done without climate science and atmospheric science. But it was kind of clear that if in a first strike, military targets such as the missile silos in the Dakotas or Montana will be hit, and military bases, that vast stretches of the country cannot be inhabited. People had to, flee or suffer radiation sickness. One thing I find interesting is the history of this. Initially, in the early 1960s, land-based missiles were thought to be a very good way to have a deterrent. This is easy to manage and operate. There's a very high probability that these rockets can be launched. Then later, when the best safe second strike arsenal was the arsenal on the nuclear submarines, the motivation was turned around. This now is a target in a rural area that draws in the enemy fire. It's a sponge that keeps away nuclear missiles from the metropolitan areas in the United States. But it's not quite clear if people who justify this, who argue for land-based ballistic missiles, understand consequences such as fallout. And of course, Oppenheimer and his colleagues realized already how important it is to have information, to know about the consequences of technology, in this case, nuclear weapons. So he says it is not possible to be a knowledgeable and responsible citizen / politician without an understanding of science and technology. And that's in part one thing the coalition tries to do. In addition to lobbying, we also try to improve knowledge and to distribute knowledge. I'm showing here a simulation by Sebastian Philippe. He's a member of the coalition and a scientist at Princeton. What he did is he took the weather data from 2021, and then for each day he simulated the fallout patterns if there was a nuclear attack on that particular day. I chose one that is particularly uncomfortable for Toronto. I couldn't say that this is typical, but I thought you might listen to this. So this was the weather on February 24th in 2021. Look at this color scale. This is the cumulative radiation dose that people would be subjected to. No need to understand this in detail, but notice this line here, 4, and this color code. Attach this to the color code over here. 4 gray is the dose, 4 joules per kilogram of your body mass, at which 50% of us would die from the consequences of radiation sickness. And with this in mind, you see that Toronto had to be evacuated. There's actually no point in trying to evacuate Toronto. If you try to do this, all that would happen is you would be stuck on some street or on some railway car on the way out. So in his study, Sebastian instead assumed that people seek shelter, the best shelter available. And then he tried to estimate how many people would actually die from radiation sickness. So very quickly, he did the simulation for different days. And obviously, the weather pattern changes, and it's not always Canada that suffers. This here now is this plot where he estimates fatalities from radiation sickness. This is day in 2021. This is the number of fatalities in million. The maximum is somewhere above 4 million. This here is a probability distribution, what the fatalities will be. It peaks just under a million. And then, and this goes beyond what FEMA did before, he shows a graph of a map of North America that now shows for each geographic location the worst possible scenario. So the maximum radiation dose at the worst day for that particular location. And you see that Canada, one might say, is at significant risk. And I think that someone in Canada should speak up to your government and demand that this be discussed with the American government. In my home country, Germany, I grew up close to the Swiss border. When the Swiss built a nuclear power plant, then there's an environmental impact statement where Germany has some input, where we say, what is the impact? What can we do to have an emergency response? Clearly, someone should think about an emergency response in Canada. And maybe it is also good to argue that land-based weapons may be not the best way to aim at a safe second strike deterrent. Now, I think this could be, if this came from our international colleagues, a very welcome and helpful independent angle how we can make certain arguments that make our nuclear arsenals less risky. So now, of course, the people who are in charge know all this, and they are not irresponsible, they are responsible. They have a plan how to manage this risk. This is what I want to discuss next. The first is a nuclear deterrent that cannot be overcome. Any nuclear aggressor that strikes against the United States knows that in return they will be destroyed thoroughly. And the way this is achieved is by splitting up the nuclear forces in a triad, meaning there are different forces. There's a land-based force, land-based missiles that's run by the Air Force. There's a bomber-based force. And then there's a Navy force, submarines, that at all times are out in the oceans, at all times are submerged, and basically cannot be reached by a Russian or Chinese first strike. So now, I don't know how often you think about how safe technical systems are. If you take a flight to Chicago from here, which I will tomorrow morning, I don't do this because I know that the flight has 0 probability to come down. There's a very small probability, and that's fine with me. I think this is such with all technical systems. We can work very hard to make this perfect, but there remains a small chance that something fails. That there could be a technical failure, say in an early warning system. There could be human error, or there could be a malicious act. This is not new. Here's a quote from John F. Kennedy. People know for many years that the system of secure nuclear deterrent is not fail-safe. This is from a speech at the United Nations where he said, Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident, technical failure, by miscalculation, human error, or by madness, malicious actor. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us. So Oppenheimer was aware of this, certainly Kennedy. I think the politicians of our day are aware of this. The only problem is we do not come closer to a solution reducing this risk. Let me briefly show you two examples for what can go wrong. This was during the Cold War, where a misfunction of the Soviet early warning system occurred, identifying a launch from the US against Russia. At the time, Stanislav Petrov, I think, was a lieutenant colonel. He was in charge that night for the early detection system. It would have been his duty to inform the Soviet president's office of this imminent attack. Fortunately for us, he actually had been involved in the commissioning of this new system, and he had a particular concern that it is a malfunction. So he decided to wait it out, and fortunately was right. This was a false alarm. Of course, this didn't come down well. He was demoted and finally left the military for this. We have close to 12.5 similar incidents during the Cold War. Many actually are related to the Cuban crisis, where it is thought today that we came dangerously close to nuclear war. Then I want to show you an example in the United States. This is a nuclear activist, Sister Megan Rice, a Catholic nun who had spent her life in Africa teaching as a missionary. And when she came back to the United States, she then turned to be an anti-nuclear activist. And one thing she did together with two other retired pacifists, she broke into the Oak Ridge Y-12 nuclear facility, made it through several layers of security fences, spent about 20 minutes in front of a building that holds a vast amount of highly enriched uranium, the kind of stuff terrorists would use to build a dirty bomb or, God forbid, a real nuclear weapon, and had time to paint and sing until security engaged them and arrested them. She went to prison for this for 3 years. Of course, nuclear security should be such, as sad as this is, that Sister Megan Rice never would have reached this alive. Nuclear assets have to be protected with lethal force at all times. And this is not just today, this is for the hundreds of years to come that we will have nuclear weapons. And now, the real point is the following. If this can happen in the United States, with all its economic wealth, with all its technological might, with all the training that we can give to security personnel, how is this going to look like in other countries? If we have a nuclear arsenal in the United States, it will induce arsenals elsewhere. Historically, the Soviet Union raced to develop nuclear weapons as soon as they knew that the United States had nuclear weapons. If the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons, China wants them. If China has them, India wants them. If India has them, Pakistan wants them. That's exactly what happened. Now, where are terrorists going to get their materials from? Well, from the weakest chain in this link. They don't have to steal weapons in the United States or materials where they are really well protected, as demonstrated by Sister Rice and her colleagues. They will get them where they are not as well guarded. Here's an example in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. This, I think, is in Kurchatov. The building there is a high flux reactor that's using highly enriched uranium, meaning weapons-grade uranium. This particular reactor had enough highly enriched uranium to certainly make a warhead or two. In the aftermath of the collapse of the country, the security was very limited. A great window of opportunity for non-government malicious activities to get at materials. And of course, we know that there were many attempts to get at these materials. But as far as we know, with combined efforts of Russia, of the United States and all its allies, it was prevented that materials disappeared. We cannot be entirely sure, but it doesn't look too bad. But this may be relatively harmless compared to the challenges that might arise if there's civil conflict in Pakistan or in North Korea that has nuclear weapons now, where it may be more challenging to find a partner with whom one can work in protecting nuclear materials. And now remember, we have to be able to guarantee the safety of these materials to all future of human civilization, hundreds, thousands of years. So we have to be perfect in this respect, at least, for a very, very long time. And that's just, I call it ahistoric. We never succeeded in doing anything like this. And it just seems a very risky idea to have arsenals like that. So now let's talk nuclear arms control. The most important is the non-proliferation treaty that divides the world into nuclear weapon powers and then powers that don't have nuclear weapons, but share technology for civilian purposes. Each of the non-nuclear powers that has signed the non-proliferation treaty has a so-called safeguard agreement with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that monitors very closely civilian nuclear programs around the world. Take the example of Iran. After the Iran nuclear deal was signed, the IAEA had about 170 inspectors in Iran, and using high technology to observe the Iranian program. And we kind of knew everything then, what Iran does. Since the United States left the nuclear deal, these inspectors have been expelled, and we actually don't know as much. Maybe we don't know anything. So the NPT is in relatively good shape. There are important countries like Iran that are not in compliance, or North Korea that are not part of this. But there are tensions. The nuclear powers promise in the preamble that they reduce their nuclear arsenals. There's a 5-year review conference every 5 years. I think the last one was in New York. And in this 5-year reviews, the non-nuclear powers increasingly criticize the nuclear powers for not responding to the preamble. And the probability that countries may leave the treaty to form their own nuclear arsenals is increasing. So then, I think very successful nuclear weapon-free zones. This is a very practical approach to arms control. It started with Antarctica. If no one wants to station nuclear weapons, it's easy to agree that non-nuclear weapons are to be introduced. And then over the next 40 years or so, this was expanded to vast areas of the southern hemisphere. And these nuclear weapon-free zones are also respected by nuclear powers. So, for example, the US Navy does not go to port in nuclear weapon-free zones with vessels that are nuclear armed. Then a very important and successful treaty in its time was the Intermediate Force Treaty that dealt with a situation in Europe where the Soviet Union had introduced the SS-20, a very fast mid-range nuclear armed missile. The West Europeans thought that this was an attempt to decouple Western Europe from the North American nuclear deterrent. The argument is if the Soviet Union strikes with SS-20 against Paris and London and Berlin, why would the United States get into this war with intercontinental ballistic missiles? So led by Germany, actually Helmut Schmidt, the chancellor at the time, Europe pushed for the United States to station medium-range systems in Europe. This were the Pershings and other systems. And then it was realized that this is extremely destabilizing. The flight time of a Pershing from Western Germany to Moscow is under 10 minutes. It very much looks like a first strike weapon that is stationed to decapitate Soviet leadership. It's actually thought today that this pretty much was the peak of risk for nuclear war. And people on both sides realized this very quickly. Europe had enormous public demonstrations. I think Bonn saw demonstrations with many hundreds of thousands of people in Western Germany. And both sides agreed to completely get rid of these systems. And this led to the destruction of almost 2,700 missiles. So this is actually an unheard success in nuclear disarmament. Unfortunately, with more contemporary strategic developments, for example, the need of Russia to also look eastward, there may be towards China, new needs for this medium-range missiles. Russia started to experiment with this. NATO observed this for years, and then in the Trump administration decided to withdraw from this treaty. And I think the latest on this is that in light of Russian systems that are stationed in Kaliningrad, Germany is negotiating with the United States to reintroduce medium-range systems in Germany. Important treaty is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, making illegal the testing of nuclear weapons. A big success. So it went in, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is the result of an ever increasing, ever more comprehensive set of test ban treaties. It was signed in 1996. It's still not in force, despite the fact that there are now almost 190 signatory states. It has not been ratified in some of the most important nuclear weapon states. So there's an appendix that says that these nuclear weapon states here have to sign, and the United States has not ratified it. It has not been ratified in the Senate. Actually, I think many scientists and engineers in the US nuclear weapon complex thinks that it's very advantageous to have this treaty because it prevents prospective new nuclear weapon powers from testing. The United States doesn't have to test. There's about 1,000 tests, lots of data from this test, lots of supercomputers. One can do a lot of things through simulations and through non-critical tests. But recently, this summer, some people in Donald Trump's circle, for example, Robert O'Brien, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs where they're questioning this deal and where they're saying the United States needs to be able to test again, and that perhaps one should give up on this comprehensive test ban treaty. Then an important agreement to cut off proliferation into Iran was the Iran nuclear deal. This was a deal that was negotiated on one side by the P5+1. P5 refers to the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And then the +1 is basically the European Union, represented by Germany. I think this is useful because economically it was very important to include possible trade with the European Union. And so this treaty came together. The P5+1 wanted that Iran stops fissile material production and enrichment, and that the nuclear program comes under the close supervision by the IAEA. And I think on the Iranian side, they were very interested in lifting sanctions. And then unfortunately for this treaty, there are 2 different views with regards to the treaty. One is the traditional view of nuclear arms control, that if you have a conflict between nuclear powers, take the Soviet Union and the United States, you never can hope to resolve a complex conflict like this, but you want treaties that reduce the risk for nuclear exchange. So you do not demand of a nuclear treaty that it fixes all the problems or sets a bad actor straight. But the other view, and this was certainly defended by Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, is that this treaty ought to be used to retain Iran and to push back on Iranian ambitions in the Middle East. That view dominated during the Trump administration and led to the United States leaving from the treaty. And in the meantime, I don't want to go through this in detail, how the exit occurred. I just want to mention Iran reported, I shouldn't have said fines. This is self-reported from Iran. They now have enriched certain small quantities up to 84% of uranium-235, something I didn't explain. Weapons-grade uranium is going to have a fraction of 90% or more of uranium-235 as compared to the much more abundant isotope uranium-238. In enrichment, you basically enhance the uranium-235. And so Iran is well on its way to a nuclear weapon. Its breakout time is probably measured in weeks now. The goal of the treaty was to have a breakout time of about a year. This is not something you can completely rule out, but you want to make this as slow as possible so that one can respond politically, economically, and if necessary, militarily. But now the breakout time is very short here. I think a success that's fairly recent is the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that was open for signatures at the United Nations in New York City in 2017. So far, there are 93 state signatories. 70 states have ratified. Now, the approach to this is very similar to what we discussed with the nuclear weapon-free zones. One has to do whatever is possible. The countries that have signed are countries that do not benefit from nuclear weapons, meaning, and I think as you can guess, the United States hasn't signed, and neither have the allies of the United States. And of course, Russia hasn't signed either, and its allies haven't signed. So now let's talk about strategic nuclear weapons. These are this 1 megaton fusion bombs that are the payload for intercontinental ballistic missiles. What I show here is how the number of the systems increased. I think in the mid-1980s, there were a total of almost 70,000 warheads, and then they decreased. I think they decreased massively after the collapse of the Soviet Union that occurs here. So largely for economic reasons, I think. But it's worthwhile to notice how there was really an atmosphere of distrust that led to this massive arms race. And it was very difficult in steps that happened every couple of years to agree on not building more, on reducing it, to introducing anti-ballistic missile defense treaties. And I think this created an environment of trust that by the dissolution of the Soviet Union helped to prevent this dissolution turning violent in an international conflict. So it was a framework in which the weakened Russia could give up and reduce its arsenals in a controlled way. Unfortunately, a country always, there's a national interest clause. If a treaty is not longer consistent with the national interest of a country, they can leave. The United States left the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001. This was the second Bush administration, so that the US can pursue missile defense. I think this was driven by concerns that arose after 9/11, that there could be a rogue nuclear attack from Iran or from North Korea. Then in the Obama administration, there was a big step forward with the New START treaty, ballistic missile and warhead treaty that limits the strategic warheads to 1,550 on both sides. These are the numbers that presently are in force, and it limits the number of strategic delivery vehicles. So the missiles that, or bombers or cruise missiles that transport the systems to 800. Unfortunately, it appears that this treaty will fall victim to the war in Ukraine. Russia has discontinued the inspections that it has agreed to under this treaty. So I want to end by quickly going through what unfortunately is a legacy of the Obama administration, the modernization program for nuclear weapons that the United States is pursuing. So the Obama administration was very aggressive in trying to really turn around the situation on the nuclear threat. New START, there was a nuclear summit in which countries came together to control nuclear materials. But the price for this politically was to agree to a modernization of nuclear forces. And I quickly go through the different components. Here, the Minuteman III, there are 400 of them. These are the silos used in this climate simulations that I showed you. They're in the Dakotas and Montana. There are 400 of them. They will be replaced by the so-called Sentinel program. The contract for this, 140 billion, is with Northrop Grumman. So this is actually in process. The Physicists coalition in our congressional engagement days, we have suggested that this should be abandoned. We believe that this is not a safe second strike arsenal. The arsenal on submarines and bombers can be much better protected from a first strike. And then the consequences of having the sponge in the Northwest through fallout are just enormous. Then for the submarines will be replaced at a cost also of about 140 billion. Then here the missile can be used through 2084. The Trident II just has been modernized. And then for the bomber-based fleet, the B-2 will be replaced by a new B-21 bomber. For the B-52 lifetime will be extended, and that costs about 70 billion. The Physicist Coalition thinks that this should be a focus as compared to the land-based missiles, because this is the only recallable system. You can launch a bomber immediately if there is an alarm, and then hours later recall them while they are crossing the polar seas. So very much reducing the risk of escalation by technical failure. Then a big cost item is on the warhead side, plutonium, and then making them into warheads. And one thing that's shown here is that this cost escalates or increases. So it was in the 2015 budget projections for the next 25 years, it was thought to cost 300 billion. The same estimate now is 650 billion. And putting this all together, there's a $1.5 trillion program to modernize some components of which destabilize. And there's also a lot of opportunity costs. There's a lot of money that could be spent on other things. That could be conventional systems for security, that could be research, technology, etc. So very briefly, this is a summary, the beginning of a summary from what we did during our congressional engagement days. So these are the teams that visited different congressional offices. We basically confront them with these asks that I briefly summarized over the last 3 slides. But I want to put this into perspective. We really need help. We were 40 for 2 days. Northrop Grumman, that owns the 141 billion Sentinel program, they have 380 full-time lobbyists that are in DC 365 days a year. So they can talk to both houses within 2 days if something is really important to them. This is what I think we are up against, or if as regular citizens that do not own a major corporation. I think it's really important that people join and try to be responsible citizens and advise and influence their decision makers, their political leaders. And the whole situation is further complicated by China building up its armament. I'm not going to go in details, but China for many years had less than 200 warheads. It's a limited deterrent. China said, if only a handful survives and we can strike against Los Angeles or maybe against New York City, the United States is not going to attack us. Not unreasonable, it seems, and very economical. But the policy has changed. They are now on a track to quickly ramp up to arsenals that are like Russia's and China. And I have to say, this is not happy news. We presently do not have a good idea how to manage the threat from nuclear weapons. The proliferation situation is very, very serious. And I think you may want to consider to organize something here in Canada and maybe work with your political leadership. And you also would be very welcome to join us in our coalition. Thank you.